Hey, the UFC Cutting Room Floor is back. Can you believe it? Um, it's been a little while. I had hoped that this would be more of a consistent thing over the past year, and unfortunately, the UFC's kind of screwed me on this, so it hasn't been. Not to say they've done anything directly to mess me up, but when I started developing the show, it was around the idea that every month regularly, the UFC on the first was cutting a bunch of fighters, releasing a bunch of cuts, and it made it pretty easy to do a regular show around that about the news. And suddenly they stopped doing that, so I kind of had to start figuring. And in fact, they kind of just stopped cutting a lot of people regularly, so I just had to figure out how is this show going to go forward. It looks like they might be back on something similar to the 29th of every month now, getting rid of people, but until I know that's dependable, the show may not be. But I'm back now because we do have a big bunch of cuts, and I want to talk about them, get it out on the airwaves to all you people, especially those of you who hate reading. I know you're out there because obviously all this stuff gets published and written about. But this is the internet. If you don't have to read shit, why should you? You know, why would you? Um, this time, looking back, obviously at the month of January, bunch of people got released, a bunch of people got signed too, so lots to talk about. And one thing I want to get out of the way right from the start is somebody recently came to me and said, "Hey Zane, when you write these articles," and I'm talking about writing, so I'm sorry for all you people who are just here for the non writing parts of the show, but when you're writing these articles about this, why do you always say, "Oh, this guy's not very likely to come back to the UFC, and this guy's not very likely to come back, and this guy's not very likely to come back"? You don't know, you can't predict the future. You don't know who's going to come back and who's not. And I really love X Fighter, and so I think what it essentially boils down to is, oh my God, this guy was my favorite. I can't believe they cut him, and how could you say he's not going to come back to the UFC? I love him so much, and you're an asshole. Which, granted, it may be true, but so I wanted to explain this just a little bit because, and this is all secondhand. Obviously, I don't have Joe Silva's phone number. If I did, I'd be texting him all sorts of shit all the time, and I'd probably then lose his phone number immediately because of that. But I don't, I'm not in their heads. But if you look at the UFC and who they tend to re-sign, there are two factors that tend to play principally into guys getting re-signed by the UFC once they've been cut. The first one is age. The second one is location. Young fighters, guys who get released essentially early in their career. I say young, but early in their career have a good chance of going out, doing real well out on the regional scene and coming back. And then foreign fighters are just more valuable to the UFC. Guys who are, Brazilian fighters, European fighters, Japanese, Korean fighters, Australian fighters, these guys are all more valuable because every time the UFC wants to go to an international show, everybody has to get a visa. So if they can get fighters, especially in Europe, and with the whole like free travel zone in Europe, I can't remember what the thing's called right now, but you know what I mean. There's a bunch of countries you can travel among them if you're a citizen of one of them. With the whole free travel zone thing, if you're a European fighter, you and the UFC wants to put on cards in Holland and the UK and Croatia and Germany and wherever, you are you are immediately more valuable to the UFC because of that. So guys who are European fighters, guys who are Brazilian fighters, guys who are Asian fighters, they got a lot more chance of getting re-signed if they get cut than your average American fighter. And that's just kind of the way it is, unfortunately. So looking over the guys who got the axe this last month, and there were a bunch of them. Starting back, since it's been a little while, starting back with Piotr Hallman, Polish fighter, back in January. And then Anthony Perosh retired, the Hippo. Mike Pierce, longtime UFC vet, got cut. Steve Montgomery, tough Black Zillions versus ATT guy, got cut. Brazilian Valmir Lazaro, Brazilian lightweight. Leo Kuntz, who of the infamous Bang Kuntz matchup, got cut. Steve Kennedy, Aussie. Hader Hassan, also from the ATT Black Zillions uh, season, got cut. A little bit surprised about that one. I'll get back to why. Konstantina Rockin got cut, Russian heavyweight. Danny Castillo, longtime Team Alpha Male lightweight. Akbar Areola, Mexican lightweight. Mauricio Alejandro Jr., he of the Lyoto nickname, former Tough Brazil finalist, um, got cut. Benson Henderson, obviously, he moved off into Bellator, and that was a huge deal. Big loss for the UFC. Chris Carriasso retired flyweight. Scott Jorgensen has. I'm not sure if it's right to say he got cut or if he's a free agent. Either way, it doesn't look like the UFC is interested in having him back. He fought out. Or he's out of his UFC contract now, one way or another. Yui Chil Nam, Korean Bulldozer, featherweight, and George Root, bantamweight, longtime UFC bantamweight. All those guys got cut. And looking over the guys that are unlikely to return, like I say, obviously you got the Americans: Roop, Jorgensen, Kuntz, Castillo. They're all pretty unlikely to come back. They're all, especially except for Kuntz, they're all seasoned vets. They all had long UFC careers. They all had long losing streaks at the end of them. It seems like it would take kind of a minor miracle outside the UFC to bring them back. Kuntz, on the other hand, he just seemed like a guy who he kind of came up crushing a lot of cans, and he just didn't seem ready for the UFC. And as an American guy who didn't show the UFC a lot of potential, I mean, he could come back, but it's just hard to imagine. Like I say, Americans just aren't that likely to get re-signed necessarily. On the international side, you also had Hallman and Iraqian as international fighters that I just do not see as likely to come back. Both had PED busts during their UFC tenure. Iraqian especially, he released a statement pretty soon after where it's just like, I don't ever care about being back in the UFC, and it was just a bunch of guys looking to wrestle and not fight and all that. And he just seems like he's burned his bridges behind him. So that's worth noting as to why a guy like that might not get cut or might not come back, even though he's a heavyweight early in his career and he put on some terrible fights for the UFC. So I'm sure they don't appreciate it. Same with Hallman. He had PED. He failed a drug test down in Brazil, and he's fighting out of Poland, which the UFC has some plans for. I wouldn't be necessarily shocked if he came back, but given his drug test failure and given just how much talent there is coming out of Poland these days, it seems like if they come back and they're looking for another lightweight, they're going to have a lot of guys to choose from outside of him. Otherwise, Perosh retired, Carriasso retired, and Akbar Areola, Mexican fighter, he's already got a pretty long career under his belt, so I'd be pretty surprised to see him back in the UFC. Guys that I would see as reasonably likely to come back, you have Yui Chil Nam, Korean Bulldozer. His UFC tenure wasn't great, but especially in Korea, if they're putting on more shows in Korea, I could easily see him be a guy that with a couple regional wins comes back. Same with Marcio Lyoto, Alexandre Jr., tough Brazil guy. I could see him going out and getting some wins. He seemed like a talent that just was not quite ready for the UFC yet, but if he went out and refined his game a bit, got a few more regional wins, he could be right back in the UFC for a future Brazil trip. Same with Valmir Lazaro. I also wouldn't be surprised if Hader Hassan came back as a tough finalist, especially, and as a brawling power puncher. Seems like maybe if he was willing to drop in weight and go down to lightweight at some point and pick up some wins, I could see him coming back. Steve Kennedy was not great for the UFC, but Aussie shows, they always end up seeming to need somebody at the last minute, and there's not a deep talent pool to draw from down there. So if he does well on that circuit, I wouldn't be surprised to see him. And while Mike Pierce is a late, long seasoned vet guy that UFC let go and who's in his mid 30s now, he actually hasn't been fighting quite as long as you'd think. Started his career, I think, back in like 2008, I want to say. hasn't been fighting an exceptionally long time. So if he went out and got some strong UFC wins, he still looked good in his last UFC fight. Got some strong non-UFC wins, did well regionally. I could see him taking advantage of his long relationship with the UFC to come back in on a short notice card. Um, all those, that kind of covers the cuts. Like I say, I've kind of divided it up into likely and unlikely, and I wanted to explain why a little, just because everybody's like, oh, you're always like not, these guys aren't likely and these guys are not getting a shot again and all that. And I wanted to explain a little of the methodology of that, just because I don't know. It just comes from what I've seen. Like, you look at guys who've come back to the UFC, and you're looking at, Todd Duffy and Walt Harris, both young guys. Anthony Johnson, who got released as a pretty young guy. Igor Pokrayets as an international fighter. Like, that's how valuable that can be, especially at light heavyweight, where there's just not a lot of talent. And just you go down the road or go down the line, and so many of the guys, Chris Camozzi, that's actually kind of a surprising one, but still, released as a reasonably young guy. So many of the guys that tend to be able to bounce back from being cut either tend to be young or they tend to be fighters that aren't U.S. based. They don't. You see a guy, like somebody like Scott Jorgensen, who might have something left in the tank, but and might be able to find some regional success, but it just feels very unlikely that they would be brought back. Otherwise, talk about a few signings now. This has been like the heavyweight spring for the UFC. They've signed roughly 10 heavyweights in the past 6 months. They are just running rampant through that division. It seems like the first time in a half decade that the UFC has gone out and gotten a bunch of new heavyweights. You're looking at Francis Ngannou and Damian Grabowski and Luis Henrique and Cyril Asker and Jarjis Danho and Biljal Makov and, well, not Makov, he's been a little more than 6 months, but Bojan Mihajlovic, Adam Milstead, Dmitry Smolyakov, Marcin Tybura, all these guys. In the last month alone, you have Asker, Milstead, Mihajlovic, Smolyakov, and Tybura. Of those, Tybura is obviously the biggest name, former M1 champ, Polish fighter, great sub grappler, grinding wrestler, could really tough chin, could have a bright future. Milstead is the big American name coming out of the U.S., fighting out of Pittsburgh. Powerful, tall, athletic guy, played some college football, still learning the ropes, very willing power puncher. Seems like he's somebody who will find success reasonably at the bottom end of heavyweight, and then, he's got some work to do to grow his game. But if he can do that, could have the athletic tools to really stick around in the division. I'm also interested in Dmitry Smolyakov as a bit of a sleeper pick in this group, as a Russian master of sport in freestyle wrestling and a coach for Joanna Jędrzejczyk's team out in Poland. And just a really big, powerful, or I think he's actually a master of sport in Greco, rather, and just a really big, powerful wrestler, kind of in that Dan Henderson mold of a guy that just seems like an immovable object on his feet. Got some nice, actually kind of quick hands as a boxer. Somebody who can mix things up a little decently, pretty fresh to the sport. I kind of think that might be a dark horse pick for the heavyweight division. Somebody I'm interested in, more interested in than maybe somebody like Asker, who has a boxing background and is French and is an EFCA champion down in Africa, and just seems like he has a style that's made to get picked apart in the UFC's heavyweight division. Otherwise, they've got picked up some guys around some of the other divisions, especially going into that European market, getting ready for this Croatia show. Damir Hadzovic, Bosnian Danish rather, lightweight, who's fighting Mairbek Taisimov of all people. Good power punching kickboxer, straight straight through MMA, didn't ever have a kickboxing career or anything like that, but fights primarily as a kickboxer. Has some real power in his strikes, willing brawler, tough guy. Seems like he could be a fun fighter for the division. I don't know that he's going to do that well to start, but after he win or lose against Taismov, I expect him to improve. Filip Pajic, a Croatian fighter they picked up, seems like a great athletic talent. Also, a MMA neophyte, somebody who started their combat sports career as an MMA fighter. Good pocket striker, willing grappler off his back. Kind of interested to see if he's got a game that'll survive in the UFC, or if we'll see some, if he's somebody who's really going to have to figure out how to wrestle to compete at this level. Bojan Velikovic, Serbian fighter, fighting out of the U.S., fighting out of T.J. Dillashaw's Elevation team out in Colorado. Good, big, powerful athlete, bit of an all-around fighter. Fighting at middleweight, having moved up from welterweight. So I don't know if he's just going to debut at middleweight and then drop back down, or if he's going to stay there. Interesting, tough guy, could be a scrappy action fighter for the division. I don't know that I see him as like a long-term super talent, but interesting fighter. Also, Alessio Di Chirico, Italian middleweight, the first Italian guy the UFC has signed for a long time now. Not since Alessio Sakara. They had one other one who's escaping my memory, short-lived, I believe light heavyweight. But Di Chirico looks like a serious athlete. He's fighting Velikovic in his debut, and I'm really interested to see what Di Chirico can do. Also, kind of a well-rounded fighter, good wrestler for the Italian MMA scene, but don't know how much that means. Has some good power and speed and coordination, but training out of an Italian gym, so it's kind of tough to tell how his game's a bit piecemeal. And middleweight's a weird division that there aren't necessarily a lot of regional tests out there for middleweight fighters. So I'll be very interested to see how he does in the future in the UFC. And they also picked up Augusto Mendez, who was supposed to make his debut in Boston, featherweight. Ended up being replaced by Kyle Bochniak, another newcomer who put up a good showing against Charles Rosa. But Augusto Tanquinho Mendez, is a very, very good BJJ grappler. One of the rare guys that's kind of a good enough talent that even though he got injured after they signed him, usually when a fighter gets signed and gets injured for a short notice debut, gets signed for a short notice debut and then gets injured before that short notice debut, the UFC just cuts him. They don't want guys who can't meet a short notice contract obligation when they've been signed for a short notice fight. But Mendez is a particularly interesting enough grappling talent that they've decided to stick with him, wait till he's healthy, and give him a debut fight. So I'll be very interested to see what he can do down the road. That covers all the signing and cutting news for the last month. Other than, and I should know, I consider him signed after his debut, Mickey Gall, who beat Mike Jackson to get the severe privilege of facing CM Punk at some future date when Punk is finally healthy, if that's ever an actual fight that happens. Kind of a weird clown show, weird circus. I will be very interested to see if they actually give Gall a UFC fight if Punk never fights in the UFC. That's something that is a situation worth watching, because at now an official record of 2-0, Gall is about as severely underdeveloped as UFC talent comes, and they tend not to be in the business of developing talent. So if CM Punk never fights, I have no idea what they do with Mickey Gall from here on out. I say something to watch. Maybe if they do another random tough season in a underdeveloped foreign market like tough Turkey or tough India or something like that, that'll get Mickey Gall a fight. But otherwise, I have trouble seeing how they build him in one of their deepest divisions at welterweight. Anyway, not a big show, but a lot of movement in there. I don't know, a lot of guys worth talking about, a lot of interesting signings and cuts. The heavyweight division overhaul, that's 10 heavyweights is a third of the division, or closer to a quarter now with that sign. But they're really putting a lot of talent in that division to see if they can build some future contenders. They've had a lot of trouble doing that over the years, so something to watch. Most of the cuts are nothing too surprising. A lot of old talent that's on their way out, or underperforming guys they picked up who really just don't look like they have the skill to compete long term in the UFC. No huge shocks other than Benson Henderson, which I didn't I forgot to address. I do think Henderson will be back in the UFC at some point, as he is himself has stated his desire to end his career there, and he seems like the kind of guy who will do well enough over the years with Bellator that he will still be able to swing out a valuable end of career contract with the UFC on the other end. But who knows? That's way too far out in the future for meaningful prediction. Anyway, thanks everyone for tuning into the show. You can find me on Twitter at TheZaneSimon. Give this video a thumbs up. That's this thing. Subscribe to MMANation.com, DOTCOM, for all other videos and all that. This isn't a UFC event week, so I don't know how much video content. We'll have Knuckle Up coming on Sunday, and then all the content getting ready for Cowboy versus Cowboy next week. But until then, thanks for tuning in. Keep on Bloody Elbow. See you around.